Okay, thank you so much. So this is what we'll be covering today. First, we'll take a look at how things are changing with respect to communications in the enterprise. Next, we'll go into the specific risks and legal issues of social media and talk a bit about who's actually using social media. Then, we'll cover recent guidance from the Commission and FINRA. Then we'll share with you some stories on what can go wrong and the types of controls that are available, including our Socialite platform. My name is Joanna Belby, and I'm the Communications Compliance Specialist here at Actance. I'm an enthusiastic social media user, as well as having worked at FINRA for a number of years, creating and delivering more than 350 educational events a year. Plus, I ran my own training company for a while. Here at Actance, I help regulated firms deploy social media effectively while complying with the rules and regulations. My biggest challenge is getting all the key stakeholders in the room, whether that's HR, legal, compliance, risk, governance, investor relations, corporate communications, marketing, all the lines of business, and of course IT and security, and getting them to talk to each other so they can work collaboratively to create social media policies for their firms that Atkins can then implement. So let's kick this off by taking a look at how communications have evolved. If you turn back the clock 20 years ago, it was all about email. When you think of electronic communications back then, that's all there was. Nowadays, email is just a piece of the bigger pie. Companies are deploying new forms of communications left and right, and the pace is only accelerating. It's likely that you're using several real-time communications tools to do business at this very moment. I know I am. I've used email and texting and WhatsApp from my colleagues in the UK and Skype and Twitter. So for you, these could include unified communications platforms like Microsoft Lync and IBM SameTime, collaboration tools like Chatter or IBM Connections or Jive, or it could even be IM networks such as Corporate Link IM or maybe public-facing one like Yahoo Messenger. You may even be using specific community networks geared towards specific industries. For example, Reuters and Bloomberg are widely used in the financial services sector. And of course, we can't forget about social media networks, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And we also can't forget about other forms of communications that your employees may be using in the organization, whether blessed by IT or not. These could be applications like blogs, wikis, Dropbox, you name it. What I'm getting at is you're faced with a very complex communications landscape that could be very different 2 years from now, probably 6 months from now. Facebook could become a relic or a bank, who knows? But strip away the complexity and the bells and whistles, at the end of the day, you still have to comply with the applicable regulations, corporate policies, and legal requirements. In order to take advantage of all these new forms of communications, you must secure the corporate network, comply with corporate governance and regulatory requirements, and enable your distributed teams, such as your financial advisors, your insurance agents, brokers, client managers, to allow these internal teams and internal users to engage with their clients, prospects, partners, and other internal groups. So let's take a look at each of these challenges in turn. So first of all, IT needs to secure the corporate network, making sure that confidential information does not leak out of the organization. Secondly, IT needs to protect the organization from incoming threats. People these days are fairly well educated on the dangers of phishing email and generally don't get tricked into downloading files that contain malware. However, that learning hasn't translated to other forms of communications. So when I'm connected to someone on Facebook or over instant messaging, for example, I'm more likely to trust messages from what appear to be my friends. Cyber criminals understand that these new channels of communications are far more receptive to attack. Now, the second area is compliance. Compliance is tasked with making sure the company stays out of the regulatory and legal crosshairs. In fact, there are more than 10,000 rules and regulations that impact electronic communications in the U.S. alone. Regulatory sanctions have already begun in the financial services world. We'll be discussing examples later in this webinar. Your compliance department is also responsible for providing proof of compliance when regulators conduct their on-site exams. And finally, if the company is sued, they are mired in electronic discovery, which can take days and weeks to piece together conversations. The final risk, your executive team is likely concerned about enablement and the organization's productivity and bottom line. Employees need to be able to collaborate in real time over instant message, enterprise social software, and unified communications. Your sales enablement or marketing team needs to train sales to engage clients and build customer relationships over social networks. And now once you've invested in all the tools, how do you get everyone to adopt them and be productive? Finally, if you want to show ROI in your communications investments, interestingly, the FFIEC, a regulator in the retail industry, recently issued final guidance for retail banks that stressed the importance of a risk management program as well as periodic evaluation of the effectiveness of a social media program. So who wants to use or who's using social media within the enterprise? Well, adoption of social media in the enterprise is being driven by individuals and departments within the company, such as marketing and PR teams, who want to use social networking for corporate messaging and advertisements, or analysts who wish to publish market-relevant data. And some firms are allowing their financial advisors and producers to use social media to conduct business as such. These are the folks who need right access. Conversely, there are other corporate users that may only need read-only access. This could be departments like HR, compliance, IT security, which might use social media to research new hires or conduct investigation. And then there's the issue of personal use. We found that restricted personal use is generally okay, just as long as clear guidelines are made available company-wide. So let's turn our attention now to the topic of how to use social media while complying with the various rules and regulations within the securities industry, and take a closer look at the risks associated with compliance and e-discovery. So far, we've seen different countries around the world that have issued specific guidelines for financial services firms. The U.S. was the first in January of 2010 with FINRA Regulatory Guidance 1006, closely followed in the U.K. in the summer of 2010 with a notice from the Financial Services Authority. We've since seen guidelines from IROC and the Canadian Securities Administration and SEBI out of India. We've also seen additional guidance from FINRA and the SEC as well. And here are just a few of the regulators that have weighed in on social media. You can see the FTC with their focus on disclosures, FINRA and the SEC, which we'll be taking a deeper dive on, regulators from India, Canada, the UK, retail and the insurance industry. Even the FDA has offered the most granular guidance to date. Even if you're not governed by the FDA, their guidance is certainly worth a look when it comes to social media. It's very specific, and there's actually screenshots. And these regulators are working together. Just recently, SEBI in India helped the SEC to crack down on a dubious money collection scheme by two Indian-based operators using social media to pitch high-yield securities online. Governments and regulatory agencies throughout the world are also tracking the rise of social business very closely. As a summary, there's no shortage of regulations out there that govern data breaches, archiving, and how unified communications, instant messaging, and social networking tools can and should be used. Today, we'll be talking about guidance offered by FINRA for registered representatives and the SEC for registered investment advisors. But first, we'd like to provide some context. There are two major types of financial advisors, broker-dealers and their registered representatives, and registered investment advisors and their investment advisors. FINRA regulates registered representatives and the SEC regulates investment advisors. To make it even more complex, some financial advisors are duly registered, which means that your compliance department currently needs to interpret two sets of rules and regulations. As you can see from the chart, there are subtle but important differences between the two. One area currently in the news is around making recommendations to customers. Under current regulations, registered representatives must make, quote, suitable recommendations, meaning the investment has to fit the customer's needs and tolerance for risk as they know it. However, Investment advisors have a higher bar. They have a fiduciary responsibility to their clients and are required to put their clients' interests first. There are those who say the current rules don't go far enough to limit conflicts of interest for registered representatives who are paid by mutual funds and other companies for selling their products. There's a lively discussion going on at the moment about who is best able to manage and supervise these advisors. As many of you know, the Department of Labor is going ahead with a proposal to produce a new standard of fiduciary duty to anyone giving retirement advice once they process and read the thousands of comments and letters they've received on the matter. It will be interesting to see how this all plays out. However, in the meantime, both the SEC and FINRA consider social media as a form of electronic communications. Therefore, registered users are required to follow the rules and regulations surrounding electronic communications even during their downtime or time away from the office if they are identifiable as a representative of the organization. In other words, if they list the firm as their employer. To make it even clearer, if it's written down, it's a written communication. When I work with securities firms regulated by FINRA, I assure them that the regulators didn't create new rules and regulations specifically for social media. FINRA and other regulators view social media as just another form of electronic communications and as such ought to be treated as such. Instead, we are tasked with interpreting existing rules and regulations around electronic communications. There are two main FINRA regulatory notices for you to review when creating social media policies for your registered persons, 1006 and 1139. It all basically boils down to three main areas. One would be record keeping. Two is advertising or content, and most important, in my opinion, three, supervision, as the regulators make it quite clear that you cannot outsource supervision. So how does this apply to social media? First, to apply to record-keeping requirements, your firm needs to capture, archive, and make e-discoverable written communications. And to clarify, the regulators aren't interested in personal communications, only business as such. Firms tend to prohibit their financial advisors from retweeting or favoriting on social networks to avoid record keeping and some advertising responsibilities associated with the adoption or entanglement of third-party content. Another issue is suitability. For example, FINRA expressly prohibits investing recommendations for specific products or general investing recommendations such as buy, sell, hold, unless your financial advisor knows his customer and can make suitable recommendations based on their risk profiles and investing objectives. Therefore, most firms do not allow their registered representatives to pitch products or to make any general investing recommendations, which is actually in alignment with best practices on social media where no one wants to be sold to. Then, when considering content or advertising, communications with the public need to be appropriate. Just as you wouldn't guarantee returns in a brochure or a print ad, you can't make performance guarantees on social media either. In FINRA Regulatory Notice 1006, FINRA also made the distinction between static advertisements and interactive communications. Advertisements that are static, such as a profile on LinkedIn that includes promotional information about your firm, must be pre-reviewed by a registered principal of the firm unless it's simply business card information. Whereas interactive communications, such as in-mail and updates on LinkedIn, may be post-reviewed or supervised after the fact. On a similar topic, unlike the SEC, FINRA does not specifically prohibit testimonials. However, most firms block their advisors from using recommendations and skills and expertise on LinkedIn to avoid the appearance of a testimonial. This may change with recent SEC guidance released last year that we'll be covering later in this webinar, or not. IAs will need to be very careful to maintain independence from the creation and positioning testimonials. The SEC was very clear that they do not want investment advisors to be involved in the creation of testimonials or to cherry pick through their testimonials and highlight only those that are favorable. And finally, pertaining to supervision, firms need written supervisory procedures in place that include all forms of electronic communications to be able to evidence or prove that they are following these procedures. In fact, We are consistently seeing FINRA fine member firms for not archiving electronic communications and for a lack of WSPs, or written supervisory procedures. Now, I could talk about these issues all day, but in the interest of time, we'll be sending you some documentation after this webinar that you might find really helpful. Over the last few years, as a result of the rulebook consolidation of the original NASD, NYSE, and FINRA rules, we've been seeing changes to rules that will impact social media. First, the suitability rules were updated to include investment strategies. What that means is that registered representatives must demonstrate that they know their customer in order to make even general investment recommendations, such as hold. So just as firms have tended not to allow their advisors to make product recommendations on social media, they are now prohibiting financial advisors from making recommendations on general investment strategies unless a registered principal of the firm has approved them in advance. Secondly, effective February of 13, NASD, FINRA, and NYSE communications rules were streamlined to just three main categories: institutional, retail, and correspondence. FINRA specifically excluded pre-review requirement from communications on an interactive forum such as a social media network unless, and this is the big unless, the communication makes a financial recommendation or promotes the product or the firm. FINRA has also excluded interactive communications from filing requirements. This clarification should help firms begin to deploy social media. However, be advised that record keeping, content, and supervision all still apply. In June of 2013, FINRA issued a letter that spelled out in detail what firms should prepare for exams for the use of social media. FINRA has looked at 23 firms to determine how they were using social media. FINRA really didn't find anything unusual other than what Joe Price, who's the head of advertising for FINRA, said, some faulty language. And in fact, all the firms were able to produce documentation that FINRA was seeking. However, the only real challenges was that in some cases, the conversation on social media was difficult to understand in context because of the electronic communications were stored in an email-like format that lost some of the metadata. FINRA may provide additional guidance on capturing, storing, and making e-discoverable these communications based on what they uncover as they conduct more examinations. You can find the specifics about spot checks on the FINRA website, but in short, firms need to provide the URLs of their corporate social media sites, how social media is being used by registered persons, demonstrate that there are written supervisory procedures in place that cover social media, evidence that they are supervising, monitoring these electronic communications, and to be able to list the top 20 producers using social media. And more recently, the Securities Industry Regulatory Council on Continuing Education, or they call it the Council, released the semi-annual firm advisory notice, and it included a number of educational resources pertaining to firms helping financial advisors use social media while complying with the rules and regulations. These are great resources, and I suggest you take a look at the FINRA website under Education for more details. In April of 2014, FINRA launched a retrospective review of its communications with the public rules to assess their effectiveness and efficiency. In December 2014, FINRA published a report on their assessment phase of the review. The review concluded that while the rules have met their intended investor protection objectives, they could benefit from some updating to better align the investor protection benefits and the economic impacts. To this end, FINRA recommended a combination of rule proposals, guidance, and administrative measures. FINRA solicited comments on proposed amendments to the FINRA rules governing communications with the public. The proposed amendments would impact social media, would revise the filing requirements in the FINRA Rule 2210, which is communications with the public. FINRA encouraged all interested parties to comment on the proposal by July of this year. Once FINRA processes all the comments, I would imagine we'll see some updated guidance later this year or perhaps early next year. So let's turn our attention now to the Commission, or to the Security Exchange Commission. Back in January 4th of 2012, the SEC charged an investment advisor with fraud and issued 3 alerts in an agency-wide effort to highlight the risks investors and advisory firms face when using social media. For the enforcement action, the SEC charged an Illinois-based advisor with offering to sell fictitious securities on LinkedIn. We'd like to quote directly from the SEC. "Fraudsters are quick to adopt new technologies to exploit them for unlawful purposes," said Robert Kaplan, who was the co-chief of the SEC Enforcement Division's Asset Management Unit. Social media is no exception, and today's enforcement action reflects our determination to pursue fraudulent activity on new and evolving platforms. With this enforcement action, the SEC sent a clear message that it will be carefully scrutinizing the use of social media within the financial services industry. The SEC also used the opportunity of the case against Fields to issue 2 alerts for investors. One alert warned investors of the danger of online scams, and the second investor alert, Social Media and Investing, contained tips on using social media as an investment tool to protect investors' privacy and help avoid fraud. In March of 2013, the SEC also provided firms with some guidelines on filing requirements for social media. The guidance was in response to a, quote, "an abundance of caution," end quote, resulting in unnecessary filings with FINRA, and clarified the types of advertising communications that should be filed. In short, the SEC provided examples of what and what not to file. In April 2013, the SEC also released a report that stated that the companies can use social media networks to announce key information in compliance with the Federal Fair Disclosure. Regulation FD requires companies to distribute information so that the general public receives the information at the same time. The SEC concluded that firms may use social media to communicate with investors just as long as investors know social media will be used to disseminate such information. Then last year, the SEC issued guidance on the testimonial rules, which we'll be covering in a moment. But first, let's take a closer look at the alert specifically for the investment advisor's use of social media. In the SEC's National Examination Alert, Investment Advisor Use of Social Media, the SEC staff of the Office of Compliance Inspections and Examinations states that firms' use of social media must comply with federal securities laws, including anti-fraud provisions, compliance provisions, and record keeping. Further, the SEC noted that many firms have overlapping procedures that apply to advertisements, clients' communications, which may or may not include social media. They warned that this lack of being specific creates confusion. The SEC also said that firms should identify risk and then test whether their in-house policies and procedures effectively address these risks. The SEC identified 13 factors that an investment advisor may want to consider when evaluating the effectiveness of its compliance program. As you can see, it's not an exhaustive list, but certainly enough to get you started. From clearly establishing user guidelines to thinking through how you would monitor social media sites, as well as how often. For example, the SEC warned that due to the nature of social media spreading information quickly to thousands of people, post-reviews days after the fact may not be sufficient. The SEC also suggests that firms design and implement workflows for pre-approving content and train and certify your IAs on the use of social media. Also important, are there enough resources dedicated to monitoring activity? Like FINRA and the IROC in Canada, the SEC points out the importance of training, as well as suggests examining the functionality of each social media site to ensure privacy for clients. They made special mention about the risk of data security, as social media can make firms more vulnerable to data leakage and malware. In summary, the SEC is suggesting that each firm identify and thoughtfully think through the compliance factors that may represent risk for the firm, and then test whether existing policies and procedures address or mitigate those risks. Then about 18 months ago, in March of 2014, the SEC offered guidance on how the prohibition on testimonials in the 1940s Act would impact social media. The SEC said as long as there's no material connection between the IA and the testimonials, IAs and IARs may use testimonials on social media, just as long as they don't cherry-pick through them. In other words, they cannot be edited and need to be presented equally. No highlighting one and hiding the others. Firms will need to make a decision if the value of positive recommendations outweigh the impact of negative ones. We've included a link to the guidance on the final slide of this deck for your review. The SEC further states that firms that allow third-party postings on their social media sites should develop policies around these third-party posts, particularly testimonials. Whether a third-party posting is a testimonial depends on all the facts and circumstances. However, SEC staff interprets the term to include clients' experience with or endorsement of an IA. The guidance spelled out some scenarios on how advisors can possibly receive testimonials on social media sites. As the SEC continues to seek and protect the investor from thinking that a particular testimonial is typical to all an IA's client's experiences, the basic principle is that the IA should be independent of the testimonial and the public should have the ability to see all the recommendations equally. No selecting only favorable recommendations, no editing recommendations, no using only one or two recommendations on their personal websites. As this guidance is fairly new, most firms probably will continue to prohibit their advisors from using recommendations and skills and expertise on LinkedIn until no social media guidelines can be written for their firms. Firms also tend to prohibit FAs from retweeting or favoriting and even not liking on Facebook in some cases to avoid the appearance of an endorsement or a testimonial. Again, this may change now and things are lightening up in that area. Then, once policies are set, firms enforce these social media usage policies with technology to block access to certain features. The final section of the SEC alert concerns record keeping. The existing Advisors Act defines record-keeping requirements for IAs. In short, like FINRA or even IROC in Canada, the SEC does not treat social media any differently than any other written communication such as emails or IMs. Furthermore, also like the other regulators, content is determinative, meaning that the content will determine the record-keeping requirements. The SEC and other regulators are only interested in communications, business communications as such. All these social media communications, such as status updates, direct messaging, texting, etc., must be retained and be easily available for inspection for at least 5 years. The SEC also says that firms should conduct employee training programs specifically for record-keeping requirements and do spot checks to make sure employees are complying with the policies. These records should be indexed in such a way that they are easily retrievable. And finally, the SEC suggests that firms consider using third parties for record retention. So what are regulators looking for when it comes to social media? There's basically 3 things. The first are policies and procedures. The SEC and FINRA are looking to ensure that member firms have robust social media policies and procedures in place. FINRA has actually given examples of where it has asked firms to produce written copies of their internal social media policies, so be sure to have a social media policy in place before you start. The second is implementation of policies and procedures. The regulators want to see demonstrable evidence that internal social media policies and procedures have been implemented in the firm. Some methods of providing this evidence are to, 1, to show employees have been trained, or 2, perhaps signed off on such internal social media policies, or perhaps 3, reports that show your firms have supervised a preset percentage of these activities. You're probably aware that FINRA's suite of supervision rules went into effect last year, and these are important rules, and those FINRA examiners will be conducting interviews at the branches and headquarters to make sure to see if there's any gap between your written supervisory procedures and reality. So make sure your WSPs, as they pertain to social media, are executable and that you're doing them. And finally, record-keeping, retention compliance. Of course, regulators are also interested in seeing you are complying with record-keeping and retention requirements from a social media perspective. You may want to have the capability to demonstrate your social media compliance software solution to examiners. So what are the consequences of not adhering to these rules and regs? In early 2012, SEC alleged that Anthony Fields of Leon, Illinois, offered more than $500 billion in fictitious securities through various social media sites. In 2013, the SEC also filed an enforcement action against Interreef Limited and several other defendants for using a website and social media to operate a fraudulent securities offering. In January of 2014, the SEC charged New York-based money manager and his firm with making false claims through Twitter, newsletters, and other communications about the success of their investment advice and mutual funds they manage. The SEC's order found Grimaldi also making misleading statements on Twitter. He claimed responsibility for model portfolios in his newsletters that, quote, doubled the S&P 500 in the last 10 years. However, Grimaldi made the claim even though he had no involvement in the model portfolio for the first 3 years. Grimaldi agreed to pay a penalty of $100,000, and he and his firm agreed to be censured and comply with certain undertakings and included the retention of an independent compliance consultant for 3 years. These activities by the SEC will only intensify as more fraudsters use social media to defraud investors. And as for FINRA, the first FINRA sanction for social media was Jenny Ta. She was referred to in the FINRA advertising conference way back when as the tweeting broker. Ms. Ta was a registered broker in California, and in January of 2011, FINRA found that she had failed to inform a registered firm principal that she had a Twitter account, which she was also using to periodically pitch a specific stock. FINRA also found Jenny's tweets often predicted price increases, and she didn't disclose her family's substantial position in that stock. She was sanctioned by FINRA, fined $10,000, and suspended for 12 months. Then there was William Hicks, Jr. His YouTube videos included oversimplified claims, omitted material information, provided exaggerated, unwarranted, or misleading statements or claims. The content also wasn't pre-approved by a registered principal of the firm. He was fined and suspended. And in September 2013, Charles Matassi's Facebook post defending drug stocks violated FINRA Rule 2210 and 2010 and were deemed not fair and balanced. Matassi was fined and suspended. And finally, as discussed earlier, FINRA recently demonstrated the importance of having social media policies in place by outlining detailed spot checks for social media. So now that I've set the context for you and discussed the risks and the regulations, I want to give you a sense of how controls are available to address these security, management, and compliance concerns. So what do we need to do to control the fallibility of human beings? Well, first of all, manage your users' identities, whether it's their Twitter identity, their LinkedIn identity, or their Facebook identity. They should all tie back to their corporate identity, and not everyone has a Twitter ID as obvious as @Belby. And because not all users were created equal, ensure you control activities based on the risk profile of the specific individual. If it's inappropriate for a registered user to make a recommendation on LinkedIn, then turn that off, that functionality. Equally, as some users are high risk, you may only want to grant them read-only access to a social network, and you could consider turning off access to games as well. Make sure you're aware that malware comes into the organization through social networks, and ensure that you're blocking that and you're protecting users from themselves, because they regularly click on content that is sent to them through a fellow social networking user, thinking to trust the content as well as the user. Again, protect users from themselves by ensuring that the content they share is appropriate to the brand and the regulations. And for those users and for that content that requires prior approval, make sure it's moderated and ensure that a second pair of eyes, a designated review officer, is reviewing the content before it is shared. And as the SEC states, make sure you log and archive all your business communications and retain them for an appropriate period of time. Ensure that you're managing the information correctly by only recording the content that is required. Store that in a location where you've been storing the rest of your electronic communications. And look also at sharing appropriate content and measuring results, protecting your brand, and measuring what individuals are doing and the results that they are getting. At Actiance, we've been in the business of real-time communications, security, management, and compliance since 2001. So we really understand how to seamlessly integrate these real-time controls using your existing IT infrastructure. Now a bit about Actiance. We've been in the industry for over 10 years with operations around the globe, including the US, UK, and Asia. And as for me, I'm located right here in Jersey City overlooking Manhattan. All the top 10 banks in the US, 5 of the top banks in Canada, 8 of the top 10 banks in Europe are clients. In fact, More than 3 out of 4 people who work in North America's financial services industry are in our customer base. That's what that pie chart refers to. Even if you're not a financial services company, that statistic shows we have experience in dealing with large-scale, multinational organizations. Financial services, as you know, have been subject to some of the most stringent regulatory requirements, and we know how to deal with those. And we have a very broad partner ecosystem. You can see some of our partners on the screen. So whatever platform you're using for unified communications, whether it's whatever archiving system you're using, you can be confident we already integrate with it. And finally, we have more than 1,600 clients. So in conclusion, if you're interested in an evaluation, visit our website at actians.com or give us a call or email us, and we'll make sure you get set up for an evaluation within 48 hours. And for those of you who wish to do some additional reading on what we've been talking about today, especially some of the data I've referenced and the rules and regulations, we'll be sending you the above materials in a follow-up email, including this deck. You may also want to read my blogs on Forbes, 2 in particular. Yes, the SEC and FINRA like social media, and the second one, SEC says that supervision is key. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time.